One of the ways that you really know what the real taboos are by the things that actually get people punished if they say them. You can have a set of views that people proclaim to be taboos, and yet they can say them over and over and over and nothing happens to them. In fact, they can get wealthy and successful by saying them. That's often what happens. A lot of people who claim that they are brave and say things that are the off-limits views, nothing ever happens to them. They just get more and more rewarded. Their platform grows bigger and bigger. The real taboo ideas are the ones that you can't say without actually being punished. It's sort of like how you can tell a real journalist, somebody who really confronts centers of power as opposed to pretending to. Those are the people who suffer recriminations, who are threatened with imprisonment or prosecution. People like Julian Assange, you can tell that he's doing real work and confronting real power centers because he's in a prison in Great Britain and not in a CNN green room. And now we have two presidents of universities, both of whom have been fired in the past month or forced out. That is a very rare event for a university president, especially ones at major institutions like the University of Pennsylvania and Harvard, two Ivy League schools, to be forced out. And now there's an attempt to fire or get fired or forced to resign a third one, the head of MIT, the president of MIT. Now, one of the things that happened in the firing of the Harvard president was that she was caught, and she was absolutely caught, by conservative journalists who did their jobs in proving that she actually engaged in plagiarism, serial plagiarism. They looked at her academic record of writing and published peer review journals, and either they or somebody who had hired people to do it found that she was guilty of copying other people's work without credit. And I'm somebody who's written a lot of books. I've written 6 books. I've written many, many articles over the past 20 years. And I know that what she did, when I look at what she did, is something that it doesn't come from just negligence or having something slip your mind. It's from being incredibly reckless and irresponsible with how you're taking somebody else's ideas and pretending that they're your own. It's not impossible that even the most careful people might forget a quotation mark here or there, or a certain way of attribution, but to do it to that extent, that severely, in article after article after article over many years, that is more than just mild negligence. That is genuine recklessness, if not outright theft. And Harvard students are fired for much less when it comes to plagiarism. So the question of whether Claudine Gay is guilty of plagiarism, to me, is not a difficult one. It's an easy one. The question of whether or not that was the real reason she was fired, however, is a much more interesting and complex question, in large part because the same people who celebrated and caused her firing just got the president of Penn fired less than a month ago, and she didn't have any plagiarism scandal. She didn't have any scandal at all. And now they want to get the MIT president, Sally Kornbluth, fired, even though she has no plagiarism or other ethical scandals at all. What they have in common instead is the fact that they all three have been accused of permitting too much anti-Israel or anti-Semitic speech on their campus. In other words, they were guilty of refusing to censor sufficiently in the eyes of the people who hold them for Congress. That is what they have in common. They have an Israel scandal. They have an anti-Semitism scandal. They do not have a plagiarism scandal. Claudine Gay does, but the other two presidents do not. And Claudine Gay's plagiarism has actually been known for a while. There were definitely newer and more severe examples that emerged over the past several weeks, but not of the kind that would have ordinarily just gotten her fired. People wouldn't have focused on it. People wouldn't have cared, absent this broader political context. And this is how you can see what the real taboo in American society is, the thing that you cannot survive, which is either, as I said, making genuinely powerful people angry, such as the billionaire donors who donate tens or hundreds of millions of dollars to these colleges, and obviously they have a huge say in what can and cannot happen at those colleges, and they are pretty shy usually, or timid or in private about using that power because it's not a very comfortable image to have American billionaires who have immense wealth and therefore immense power using it so flagrantly to dictate to our leading institutions of higher learning what types of ideas they should and should not permit to be expressed by students or faculty on campus. And yet, ever since October 7th, which I'm starting to view more and more as the pro-Israel rights George Floyd, it has led to a tsunami of censorship and firings for expressing views and changes to language and all kinds of claims of racism against anybody who disagrees. It has a very similar climate to the one that emerged in the wake of the George Floyd killing, October 7th does. In the wake of that, people have become much bolder. Just like after 9/11, a lot of people became much bolder about ideas that they wanted and were able to exploit 9/11 to make happen. People have been able to exploit October 7th, the attack in Israel, to become much more overt about the sort of things they want done. And so you have a lot of billionaires now openly dictating to these colleges, not just that they should fire their presidents, but also that they should impose far greater restrictions on the kinds of speech that is tolerated, speech about a foreign country, about Israel, and about the US-funded war in Israel. That's the real source of what happened here. So you can lose your job as an American elite if you anger very powerful people or if you cross actual red lines, not contrived red lines, not the red lines people claim they're boldly crossing even though they do so and nothing happens to them. The real red lines, the real taboos, the things that get you fired if you say or appear to be adjacent to. So let's look at the facts here in order to ask ourselves, number one, why did Claudine Gay really get forced out of Harvard? In the context of everything that's been happening in the United States, in our country since October 7th, in the wake of the successful effort first to oust the president of Penn, the current effort already underway to oust the president of MIT. Who and what really caused this firing? And then for whom is this really a victory? Is this really a victory for the American right that feels like they have been censored and targeted and persecuted legally and culturally and on academic campuses? Or is this just another victory for establishment factions in the United States whose pro-Israel views in this particular case just so happen to align with the vast majority of American conservatives who also believe the United States should be funding Israel's wars as they're doing? So here is an article from the New York Times that is reporting on the forcing of Claudine Gay's resignation. There you see it on the screen. New plagiarism allegations force out Claudine Gay. Backlash over Harvard's response to anti-Semitism on campus led to increased scrutiny of her academic record. So you see the New York Times carefully attributing her firing both to the plagiarism as well as to the controversy over her views on Israel and anti-Semitism. And I think that is one thing that we can allow, that both things are true. She actually was guilty of plagiarism, and certainly a president of a major university probably should be removed if they're proven to have engaged in serial plagiarism, given the fact that it's an academic institution. Someone who leads the institution ought to have high ethical integrity, and you cannot sustain an institution that punishes young students for a transgression but allows the president of the institution to skate free when found engaging in far worse transgressions. At the same time, nobody would have cared about this. Nobody would have been researching her. Nobody would have been spending a lot of money, as it seems, to find out what she did 25 years ago in obscure academic journals, if not for the fact that she had become a political target, given her testimony alongside the president of Penn and MIT about the alleged increase or crisis of bigotry, namely anti-Semitism, on American college campuses. So here's how the New York Times describes this, quote, "Support for Dr. Gay's nascent presidency began eroding after what some saw as the university's initial failure to forcefully condemn the October 7th Hamas attack on Israel and some pro-Palestinian student responses. Outrage grew in early December after Dr. Gay gave what critics saw as lawyerly evasive answers before Congress when asked whether calls for the genocide of Jewish people were violations of school policies. The December congressional hearing also led to the ouster of Elizabeth McGill of the University of Pennsylvania, whose support had already been shaken in recent months over her refusal to cancel a Palestinian writers' conference. She resigned as president 4 days later. Now, there's several parts of this that I think are incredibly important here. First of all, we have what brought Claudine Gay into public controversy, which is what the New York Times describes as the university's initial failure to forcefully condemn the October 7th Hamas attack on Israel. Why should we want universities as an institution to weigh in on political controversies at all? There are students at Harvard and at most American institutions of higher learning who believe that Israel is the victim in the Israel-Palestine conflict, that the United States has some kind of moral duty to fund the Israeli military and to fund Israel's wars, as the United States does and has been doing for the last several decades, even though millions of Israelis have a higher standard of living than millions of Americans. There are a lot of people who simply believe that it doesn't matter, that Americans should go to work, pay taxes, and those taxes should then be used to finance Israel's military and finance its wars. Because Israel is such an important foreign country to the United States that we have the moral obligation to finance it and fund it and to provide it with all the bombs and weapons it needs or wants whenever it goes to war with its neighbors, which is quite often. But then you have people at these American institutions of higher learning who believe that the Israelis are primarily to blame for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You know all the arguments because they're occupying the West Bank in a way that the world considers illegal, that the United States government has long opposed under both parties. They're blockading Gaza and have been for 20 years. They don't allow the people of Gaza to leave by air because they bombed its airport. They don't allow them to leave by sea because they will kill them if they try and take boats and leave. And along with the US-funded dictator in Egypt, they don't allow anyone in Gaza to leave by land. It's very rare for people of Gaza to be permitted to leave Gaza. And as a result, other people say at Harvard and elsewhere that it's not the Palestinians to blame, but that it's Israel to blame, and that the two countries are basically in a constant state of warfare, and Israel attacks the Palestinians attack Israel, and there are people who believe that it's Israel's fault, largely or overwhelmingly, the conflict. So you have students on both sides of this issue and a lot of people in between. Why should we want institutions like Harvard or Penn to weigh in institutionally at all on our political debates? Why was Harvard somehow obligated to comment on who's to blame for a conflict all the way on the other side of the world? Why should American universities be doing this at all? Now, it is true, they have been doing this. They've been doing it on issues of race, they've been doing it on issues of LGBT equality, they've been doing it on immigration, they've been doing it on policing, they've been doing it on affirmative action. So there is an argument to make. Why would they suddenly stop doing it when it came to Israel and Palestine and to the October 7th attack? But just as is true for censorship on college campuses and elsewhere, when an institution is doing something wrong, the solution is not to call for them to do more of it. The solution is to call for them to stop it entirely. So I thought it was extremely odd that somehow these institutions, in the eyes of many Americans, were duty-bound to weigh in on a political controversy, not even involving America, the country where they are situated, but involving this one foreign country in Israel. There are conflicts all over the world, all the time, in Russia and Ukraine, in the Sudan, in various places in Africa and in the Middle East. And we don't expect institutions, universities, to weigh in collectively, institutionally, on every political conflict or any political conflict. And so that was always a very bizarre grievance, but that absolutely was a major grievance that enraged people, that these institutions, which all condemned the Hamas attack, didn't do so robustly enough, they didn't do so angrily enough, they didn't do so with enough conviction. But then we have here as well that support for her presidency, and Claudine Gay ended up being president of Harvard for only 6 or 7 months, the shortest tenure of any Harvard president in the history of the institution. She also provoked anger, as the New York Times says here, because of some pro-Palestinian student responses. And I think this is really the key to everything. As you may recall, in the wake of the October 7th attack, some student groups at Harvard and other universities exercised their constitutional rights under the First Amendment as people legally in the United States, citizens of the United States, are here legally to study, to express their political views. And they signed statements saying that they thought Israel was to blame for the conflict. They opposed any attempt by the Israelis to hold people collectively accountable or to collectively punish the people in Gaza. And there were a lot of people offended by the statements that some pro-Palestinian groups issued, including pro-Palestinian groups that are composed entirely of Jewish students or many different kinds of students, including American Jews, who are critical of Israel. And there was a sense that somehow these institutions had engaged in misconduct by allowing their student groups at these campuses who blame Israel or who are opposed to Israel to issue statements expressing their political opinions in the United States. That was the real anger. That was, as you might recall, and we'll show you this in a minute, what prompted the real leader of this effort to purge American academia of Israel critics, Bill Ackman, who has been long using his wealth to try and pressure these institutions to reform in his vision. That was really what angered him the most, was that Harvard allowed a group of Harvard students, we interviewed 2 of them, to sign a statement that condemned Israel and blamed Israel for the broader Palestinian-Israeli context. Now, you, of course, might think that that statement was reprehensible, you disagree with it, but clearly college students have the absolute right in America, at least in theory, at least under the Constitution, to express their views on a war that involves 2 foreign countries or 2 foreign entities. And yet there seemed to be a lot of rage, a lot of anger that these institutions allowed students to express their political opinions freely, that they didn't punish them, that they didn't expel them. And as you might recall, Bill Ackman demanded that these individual students, they signed this petition in the name of these student groups. That wasn't enough for him. He wanted their names divulged. And then the names of these student groups were divulged. And a lot of the people whose names were divulged didn't agree with the statement, hadn't been part of these groups for a long time, but a lot of them obviously did. And then he started saying, Bill Ackman did, that because they blamed Israel, that people shouldn't hire them. He wasn't going to hire them. A bunch of other CEOs who apparently have a strong affection or affinity for Israel started saying, yeah, we're not going to hire these people either. It became a blacklist in the United States, a no-hire blacklist, organized by some of the most powerful people in the country. And that was when this crusade against these university presidents really gained strength. And their real crime was they didn't defend Israel enough institutionally, and they permitted their students the rights of free speech. That is really what their crime has been. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.